So I want to welcome all of you who have taken some time to be with us this evening to discuss some of the ballot measures we see on our ballots for this November. I'm really pleased to be here with the rest of the team from the League of Women Voters of Oakland. And we want to tell you from the top how we will proceed. So just want to say that you do have a Q&A and you can place questions in that. However, we intend to hold questions until the end of the presentation. I think that's really all that we need to know, and we can go ahead and get started. Fiona, next slide, please. The first thing we want you to know is that this is a special program. We do a lot of programs where we go out and we educate voters about the ballot measures. We do this in person, we do this on Zoom meetings for various groups, and we have recorded one of those which you can find on our website. However, tonight we are also going to put on our advocate's hat because the League does take positions. We don't take the positions based on what political parties say or what other pundits or organizations are recommending, because we ourselves over the years do a lot of ongoing research into various policy issues. And we have accumulated quite a cache, which we update regularly, of position papers, which deal with many, many diverse issues such as campaign finance, taxation, government, natural resources. We rely on that research that we've done over the years that we update periodically, and then we do a deep dive into the actual measures that are on our ballot this year. And that'll be the basis for the recommendations that you're hearing tonight. Next slide, please. So first thing we should know is that we've got 13 things to think about tonight. 10 of them are propositions at the state level. 3 of them are measures from the city of Oakland. Next slide, please. With respect to the state propositions, it takes a simple majority to pass these propositions. So 50% plus 1 support for any proposition will mean that it passes. Additionally, it's good to know that the ones that are labeled with single digits, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, come to you from the legislature. So they've already been debated and vetted and then put onto the ballot by the legislature. The other half of the propositions that you're seeing on the ballot come to you by the initiative process. That means California voters or groups of voters or organizations gather enough signatures to qualify these measures for the ballot. Those are your double-digit propositions. Next slide, please. I want to start out because I'm going to begin, and by the way, I don't think I even introduced myself. I'm Gail Wallace from the Advocacy Committee. I'm going to take the first 3 measures, which all deal with a bond. And so let's ask ourselves first, what is a bond? It's basically a way for governments to borrow money for long-term projects. In the same way that we take out car loans or get mortgages for our homes, governmental entities sell bonds. They sell the bonds to obtain the money, and then they pay that money back with interest over a significant period of time, several decades, 30 or 40 years. Both state and local governments issue bonds. Propositions 2 and 4 involve state bonds. And there's a difference between the state and the local that I want to point out at the top. The debt that's taken on through state bonds is repaid through the state general fund. The debt that is taken on through local bonds is paid for through local taxes. All right, let's get rolling into the actual propositions. Next slide, please, on Proposition 2. Proposition 2 is the school bond. And state and local school districts share the costs of repairing and upgrading our schools or building new ones throughout the state. That means they're in the business of taking care of about 10,000 public schools and approximately 115 community colleges. To a significant extent, the state and the local school districts share the costs of upgrading or repairing these schools by issuing bonds. And so over time, what you see are requests for bonds from the state government and from the local districts to pay for their respective shares. Proposition 2 asks you to allow California to issue $10 billion in bond debt. If it passes, the money that is obtained by selling the bonds will be distributed as matching funds to local school districts who apply for grants. You should know that the last school facilities bond measure was approved 8 years ago in 2016 for $9 billion. So that money has long since been committed. The more recent bond measure proposed in 2020 narrowly failed, one of the few times a state school bond has failed to pass. This bond would borrow $8.5 billion for kindergarten through 12th grade public schools and $1.5 billion for community colleges. Next slide, please. The fiscal effect of issuing these bonds would be approximately $500 million per year, and it would be paid back over the course of 35 years. Next slide, please. There is a critical need for this bond to be passed. In 2021, after the last state school bond failed, there was a study from the Public Policy Institute of California, which concluded that nearly 40% of students attend schools that do not meet minimum facility standards, and 15% attend schools with extreme deficiencies, such as water damage, failure of the sewer systems, power failures, and structural damage so severe that certain buildings can't even be used. The League believes that all children in California schools deserve facilities in good repair and equipped to provide them with a 21st century education. Research shows that modernized school facilities correlate with better test scores, with higher attendance, and with lower suspension rates. The passage of Proposition 2 is critical to our children's health, safety, and educational progress. We recognize that there are inequities in the way districts are required to pay 40 or 50% of the cost of a project because funds are much harder and more expensive to raise in districts which do not have such high property values. This inequity hits the hardest in rural districts and those with high numbers of Latino, English learner, and low-income students. Proposition 2 makes a beginning towards redressing some of these inequities. And this is work that needs to continue and which the League of Women Voters of California will continue to advocate for. However, at the moment, the pipeline for the state funding to provide matching funds for local school districts is virtually empty. And we do no one any favors by withholding the money at this point in time in face of such great need. At the end of the day, passing school bonds and advocating for improvement in the equitable distribution of that bond money will redound to the benefit of all students. And so we recommend that you support Proposition 2. Next slide, please. Okay, notice, please, that I'm skipping Proposition 3, not because we're not going to get to it, but I'm trying to keep the bond measures together. So we're going to go through 2, 4, and 5, and my colleague Mary will pick it up with 3 again when she takes the stage. So Proposition 4 is another state bond measure where the state of California is seeking your approval to take on bond debt. By the way, the reason that you are being asked to vote on both of these state bonds is that the state constitution requires that voters approve by a majority vote this kind of bond spending. In this case, it's for a similar amount, $10 billion, and the money would be spent to improve water supply and water quality, as well as water management systems, water restoration projects for lakes and rivers. Additionally, the money would fund wildfire prevention, responses to sea level rise, and mitigation of other environmental problems associated with climate change. If you look at the right hand of the slide, you can see the breakout of the proposed spending. It's important to note that 40% of this funding will be allocated to low-income communities or those most impacted by environmental disasters or climate change. Some of the money will replace funds that were cut from the budget due to the current deficit. Next slide, please. If this bond passes, the fiscal effect will be to increase state costs of approximately $400 million per year over the next 40 years. I want to add a note that pertains to this, what I'm calling the climate bond, and also to the school's facilities bond, because these amounts of money sound very large. And one way that we assess whether it's good to continue to add to the bond debt is to look at a ratio between bond debt and the overall budget. And at the moment, this adding both of these proposed measures, if they pass, would simply bring the bond debt of California to a 3 to 4% ratio, percentage of the general budget. That historically is on the low side. It has averaged about 4% and it's gone as high as 6%. So that's just background information. Next slide, please. The economic toll of climate change, back one, I think, Fiona. I think there we go. Thank you very much. And we're still on 5. We want to be on 4. Can you advance it from there? There we go. Thank you. That's where we want to hold for a second. Here's our recommendation. The economic toll of climate change is immense. We spend billions on disaster response, on treating the health impacts of climate change, and on infrastructure repair. We have an urgent need for proactive measures to combat the increased wildfire risks, the sea level rise, and severe drought. By funding critical projects, Proposition 4 will enhance resilience, protect communities, and ensure California continues to lead in environmental stewardship and innovation. This innovation investment is essential for a sustainable and a prosperous future. Next slide, please. So I want to remind you that questions go in the Q&A, in case you're starting to have some questions, and that we'll be addressing them at the end of our program this evening. All right. We're still in the arena of bonds, but we're switching gears a bit. The first 2 bonds, 2 and 4, were requests for you to approve the state borrowing money. This is a bit different. This one also is different in the sense that it's no longer talking about state bonds, it's talking about local bonds. Right now, local bonds require a 67% majority vote to pass. Local bonds are repaid from property taxes. If you recall, on both of these counts, they're different from state bonds, which only require a simple majority and are paid from the general fund. So what Proposition 5 is proposing is to change the voting threshold for local bonds from 66.7% to 55%. What you can do with local bonds is you can obviously fund school repairs and things like that, but that level of approval has already been reduced to 55% in the case of school bonds. But local bonds can also be used to fund affordable housing for the low and the middle class, or pay for infrastructure like roads, water, and fire protection. And what this measure, Proposition 5, would like to do is make the voting requirement be 55% for those local bonds to be used for those purposes. It's likely to have no particular effect on the state budget because this is borrowing that happens at the local level. It could increase the number of local bonds that pass, since obviously the requirement of voter approval will be lowered. Next slide, please. So Proposition 5 would reduce the voting margin necessary to approve local bonds. There's a constitutional amendment that is essential to change the supermajority vote requirement that hinders the approval of local housing and infrastructure bond. The current 2/3 vote threshold makes it extremely difficult to secure necessary funding for vital housing and infrastructure projects. Lowering the threshold will allow communities to address urgent housing shortages and infrastructure needs much more effectively. By empowering local governments to act more quickly, Proposition 5 has the potential to promote economic growth, to improve the quality of life, and to ensure timely investment in essential public services and facilities. The League of Women Voters of California has signed the formal ballot measure in support of this measure, and we recommend your support on it as well. Now I'm going to turn over the presentation to my colleague, Mary Gandisberry, who's going to take a step backwards and pick up Proposition 3.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, so thank you. My name is Mary Gansberry, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about 2 state constitutional amendments, and then we'll talk about minimum wage. So the first constitutional amendment is for marriage equality. And the background of this is that in 2008, there was a constitutional amendment that indicated that marriage would only be between a man and a woman. Proposition 8 was declared unconstitutional by the Federal District Court. Then in 2015, the United States Supreme Court found that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right and allowed it throughout the United States. So what Proposition 3 would do is change this language in our Constitution that is outdated and to allow marriage between 2 consenting adults, regardless of gender or race. So the effect is that there wouldn't be any change to who can marry now under the court decisions. It would repeal this outdated language that is still in our Constitution, and it would ensure this right going forward if there was any change to the United States Supreme Court decision or other decisions about marriage, so that in California, we would have marriage equality. Next slide, please. Now, this is why we support this. Despite the 2015 Supreme Court decision guaranteeing marriage equality, our Constitution still states that marriage is only between a man and a woman, and only that type of marriage will be recognized by the state. Proposition 3 would provide marriage equality in the California Constitution. This upholds our state's values of fairness, equality, and non-discrimination, and ensures permanent protection of the right of individuals to marry the people they love, the person they love, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, or race. Any change to the federal decisions would not impact the legal recognition of marriage in California, and it would provide continuity and benefit to everyone who's married in the state. While the U.S. Supreme Court decisions have made this prohibition unenforceable that's in our Constitution now, if the decision was changed, then marriage equality would continue in the state, providing everyone with equal rights, equality, and dignity. For these reasons, the League supports Proposition 3 and urges a yes vote. Next slide, please. Okay, the next constitutional amendment is one that would eliminate forced labor in prisons. Under the Constitution, right now, there is a limit on forced labor which is not allowed other than in prisons. The passage of this Proposition 6 would protect people in prison from being disciplined for if they choose not to work. It would allow voluntary work and credits and privileges for that work, but it would not be forced. And no opposition was received to Proposition 8. The fiscal impact of this is somewhat unknown. The potential increases or decreases could arise from the need to pay a wage exceeding less than $1 an hour, which is now paid. The Department of Corrections would be required to develop a voluntary work program plan with rules if this is passed. This could increase payment above 74 cents, which is currently what is being paid to prisoners for their work, but it wouldn't necessarily require payment of minimum wage. Next slide, please. The League supports Proposition 6. Proposition 6 is long overdue, and it addresses a profound injustice in the state's constitution, which promotes involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime and constitutes a type of modern-day slavery. Abolishing this exception supports rehabilitation and reintegration of incarcerated people by allowing them to choose meaningful education and rehabilitative programs that are available to them over other types of labor. Ultimately, the ability to choose meaningful programs and work in prison will benefit all of society because people will have a better chance to reintegrate into prison out after they are no longer in prison. And this would help it would help all of society. By passing Proposition 6, California will right a centuries-old wrong and lead by example, uphold human rights, and ensure that a legal framework attaches to commitment to justice and equality. For these reasons, the League supports Proposition 6 and urges a yes vote. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about Proposition 32, which has a modest increase in minimum wage. So the current minimum wage is $16. This is the state minimum wage. There are other minimum wages in Oakland, or different cities might have different minimum wages, but this is just the state minimum wage. So under Proposition 32, if an employer has 26 or more employees on January 1st of 2025, it would increase to $18. If someone has less than 25 employees, then it would increase to $17 on January 1st, 2025, and $18 on January 1, 2026. A consumer price index or inflation adjustment of up to 3.5% would start in 2027. But so that would be paused just until 2027. This would not serve to reduce any higher minimum wages that might be in the local minimum wages or legislative wages, such as ordinances regarding specific types of workers, such as healthcare workers or fast food workers. So no one would get a lower minimum wage because of this. Next slide, please. The fiscal impact would be that there would be higher government costs, but which is estimated by the state that would be no more than a few $100 million annually, or less than 0.5% of the general fund annual budget. State Health and Human Services Program enrollment, such as in Medicaid or CalFresh, could decrease as income rises. Next slide, please. The League recommends a yes vote on Proposition 32. California has a high cost of living, and our current $18 minimum wage is well below the estimated living wage needed to support a household's basic needs. A minimum wage of $18 an hour will reduce income inequality and improve the standard of livings for millions of California's workers. Plus, a minimum $18 minimum wage is likely to increase consumer spending, and that will help the economy. Increased spending creates more jobs, making everyone better off. For these reasons, the League urges you to vote yes on Proposition 32. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Helen.
Thanks, Mary. So I'm Helen Hutchison, and I'm going to talk about the rest of the measures on the state ballot. Yeah, we're starting with the rent control, Prop 33. And I'm going to get to my notes here. So rent control limits how much landlords can raise rent each year. Then many local cities like Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley have some form of rent control. There is a state law called Costa-Hawkins that limits the ways in which cities and counties can legislate rent control. Cities can't impose a rent control on single-family homes or apartments or houses built after 1995. And finally, it also says that rent control is only for the current tenants. Once a unit is vacant, then the rent can get reset at the market value. So the effect of this is this measure is that it would repeal this state law, the Costa-Hawkins law, and it would also move the authority over rent control from the state to local governments. It would allow local governments to regulate rent control limits for any type of housing if they want to. The fiscal effect of this is that there's an impact on local budgets, but it would depend upon how many cities or counties pass rent controls and what landlords do. The measure would likely reduce the amount of money to some extent from property taxes. It could be up to tens of millions of dollars a year statewide. And cities and counties would also need to spend money to enforce rent control. Next slide, please. So the League of Women Voters is neutral on this measure. There is a housing crisis in California, and rent control is one way in which to offer protection to tenants. Rent control can provide short-term benefits, but longer-term, the studies show it's more problematic. Rent control can discourage the construction of new housing, and because there's lower profits for developers, so they're less likely to want to build rental housing. So on balance, we say that there's benefits to this and there's drawbacks, and so therefore we are neutral. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move now to Prop 34. This is one of the more complicated measures. There is a federal law that allows healthcare providers that serve low-income people to buy prescription drugs at a discount and then sell them at retail prices and use those profits to expand their services. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation is one of those providers. They're a group that's active particularly in Los Angeles. For the third time now this year, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation has used some of its profits to put rent control, that Prop 33, on the ballot. The California Apartment Association opposes rent control and wants to limit the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's ability to use its profits to bring this kind of ballot initiative forward. Medi-Cal provides healthcare coverage for people with low incomes in California, and that includes, it covers prescription drugs. So Prop 34 would codify some rules around the Medi-Cal prescription drug program into state law, and it would create some new rules that single out the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And it would say that they would have to spend at least 98% of their revenue that they get from selling prescription drugs on direct patient care. And when these laws will apply only to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and no one else. The fiscal effect of this is that there'd be some increased state costs to enforce these new rules. Next slide, please. The We have no recommendation on this measure because we don't have a position. We have not studied the issues that cover this measure. We only act when we have studied the area and have developed policy positions. So next slide, please. Prop 35 is another one of the kind of complicated measures. California charges health plans a tax. It's called the Managed Care Organization Tax, or MCO tax. The tax is not permanent, but is periodically reapproved by the state legislature. The current iteration of this will expire in 2026, unless they renew it. The federal government currently matches the MCO tax dollar for dollar. It currently generates $7 to $8 billion a year and is used generally to support Medi-Cal. But the lawmakers, our legislators, have used this tax money for other purposes in the state budget. So the effect of Prop 35 would make the MCO tax permanent, pending federal approval. The proposition would also earmark that tax money to increase reimbursement payments for certain types of services, such as primary and specialty care. It would prevent lawmakers from using that tax money for any other purposes or for replacing existing funds. Next slide, please. Next, so the fiscal effects of this measure, oh gosh, I've got to get back to where we are. Yeah, it would increase Medi-Cal funding, and it would also increase the state costs because we'd have expanded services. And it would especially increase the state costs if we get less federal matching money than we get currently. Next slide, please. So the League of Women Voters of California recommends a no vote on this. We believe it's a well-meaning but misguided effort to try to provide more and steady funding for Medi-Cal. By changing a temporary tax to a permanent tax and then earmarking how that money has to be spent, it means that there's less money available for other priorities, and it makes it more difficult to respond to future changes in Medi-Cal that could be mandated by the federal government. Further, the League is opposed to what we call ballot box budgeting because it limits the legislature's flexibility to make budgetary decisions and to adjust priorities based on emerging and essential needs. We believe budgetary decisions should be made by the legislature, not by earmarking funds through ballot initiatives. Earmarking can undermine the state's fiscal stability and its ability to effectively respond to changing conditions. And finally, this could inadvertently decrease overall revenue because the proposition imposes a low cap on the taxes collected from non-Medi-Cal enrollees. The cap it's designed to prevent the tax from becoming overly burdensome on some health plans, but it also introduces a potential risk. If the federal government changes the rules to require a greater share of the tax to come from commercial enrollees, then they could limit the amount of the total revenue and then reduce the overall effectiveness of the tax. So next slide, please. I'm going to move on to Prop 36. So in 2014, we passed Proposition 47, and that changed some nonviolent crimes like drug possession and shoplifting into misdemeanors. They had been felonies, which are more serious crimes, and misdemeanors are less serious crimes. And this was unless a person had prior convictions for serious crimes. Because of Prop 47, our prison population has decreased since 2014, and the money saved by the reduced prison population has been redirected towards social programs. We know that recently there's been an increase in this kind of organized retail theft, the kind of smash and grab robberies. So the effect of this proposition would be that it would reclassify theft of items less than $950 from the current misdemeanor back to felonies. if the suspect has 2 or more past convictions for a variety of different kinds of theft crimes. It adds fentanyl to a list of hard drugs, so that would increase the penalties for its sale and use. And it creates a new class of crime that is called the treatment mandated felony, which gives the offender the option to participate in drug and mental health treatment as long as they don't contest the charges. And then they'd also then have to complete the drug treatment program, and they could do that instead of going to prison. But if they don't finish the treatment, they still face up to 3 years in prison. Next slide, please. The fiscal effects of this are hard to quantify. We know that state and local criminal justice costs could rise from an increase in prison populations, and could also be an increase in the court workload. Prop 36 would also reduce the current state savings that were created by Prop 47, and that money currently is used for mental health and drug treatment programs, school programs, and victim services. So next slide, please. So once again, the League opposes this measure. Our reasoning is that this erodes the criminal justice reforms that we've started in California. It reverses advances aimed at reducing mass incarceration and promoting rehabilitation. By imposing stricter sentences, those will disproportionately impact people of color and those with low income, which will exacerbate the existing racial and socioeconomic disparities in the criminal justice system. Harsher sentences for minor offenses like drug possession and retail theft would lead back to our overcrowded prisons. This would shift money from treatment and rehabilitation to the prisons, and so that we'd also undermine programs that reduce recidivism and support reintegration into society. It would perpetuate a cycle of incarceration by reducing mental health and substance use disorder treatment, victim services, reentry assistance, programs to prevent school truancy and dropout, and crime prevention programs that prevent recidivism. So I am now going to turn it over to Debbie to talk about some of the Oakland measures.
Thank you, Helen. All right. So I'm Debbie Weinstein. I'm also on the advocacy committee of the Oakland League, and I'm going to start by explaining the 2 ways that measures get on the Oakland ballot. The city council can place a measure on the ballot, and that's what we have with Measure MM and OO, or citizens or groups can place an initiative on the ballot, which is the case for Measure NN. For measures involving property taxes, those that are put on the ballot by the city council require a 2/3 vote to pass, and those put on the ballot by initiative only require a simple majority vote to pass. Next slide, please. I think we want MM. Yeah, thank you. So Measure MM is about wildfire prevention. The Oakland Hills and adjacent areas are at very high risk of wildfires. For some background, twice previously from 1992 to 97 and 2004 to 2014, property owners in this area funded wildfire prevention. A text similar to Measure MM was on the ballot in 2013 and fell 60 votes short of passing. For the first time in 2024, the City Council adopted a comprehensive 10-year vegetation management plan to guide the use of revenues. Measure MM is a 20-year special annual parcel tax on owners of properties within the wildfire prevention zone, which is the high-risk fire zone defined by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention. Only registered voters in the wildfire prevention zone will have this measure on their ballots. So if you're an Oakland voter and you got your ballot and you don't have Measure MM on it, you're not in this zone, and you won't be voting on it or paying for it if it passes. Revenues would support management of vegetation, which fuels fires, maintenance of evacuation routes, enhanced patrols on days of high risk, ongoing inspections of individual homes, and public education. Next slide, please. This slide shows on the right a map of the wildfire prevention zone. It's a little hard to see, but we also have it on our website for better viewing. So in terms of fiscal effects, if passed, the 20-year annual parcel tax would only be for property owners in the wildfire prevention zone. And the measure would impose a tax of $99 for single-family dwellings and $65 for each unit in residential properties. The annual cost of living adjustments would raise tax rates, but adjustments would be limited to no more than 5% annually. There would be exemptions for people with very low incomes and for qualified seniors. And the expectation is that $2.67 million would be generated in the first year, beginning July 2025. Next slide, please. Although some opponents are critical of this measure since they believe that wildfire prevention should be fully funded by the city's general fund, the Oakland League supports this special tax since the most effective way to prevent wildfires is to implement a comprehensive vegetation management plan like Oakland's, and this funding is needed for the implementation of that plan in order to address the significant and growing risk of wildfires, which could start in the wildfire prevention zone and then go on to impact the wider community. Next slide, please. So the next Oakland measure I'm going to tell you about is Measure NN, which is about funding for violence prevention. So first, for some background, since 2014, under Measure Z, Oakland has collected both property and parking lot taxes to fund violence prevention and emergency response programs. The combined taxes, which now yield approximately $30 million annually, fund the police and fire departments and violence prevention programs. Measure Z will expire at the end of this year. Measure NN would continue and increase the current parcel and parking lot taxes for 9 more years and generate approximately $47 million a year. The revenues would be spent to reduce homicides, robberies, carjackings, and break-ins, domestic violence, and other gun-related violence, improve 911 emergency call response rates, and reduce human trafficking. The revenues would be split primarily between the Oakland Police Department, which would get 60%, and the Department of Violence Prevention, which would get 40%. The Department of Violence Prevention would use 75% of its share of the revenue for providing grants to community-based organizations. A fixed amount, $3 million, would go to the fire department, and a small amount would be used to administer the measure. Next slide, please. So in terms of the fiscal effects, Measure NN would increase the annual single-family parcel tax rate. You can see here from about $133 to $198, the multi-unit residence rate from approximately $91 to $132 per unit, and rates for other properties would be proportional according to size. The parking surcharge for all commercial parking in Oakland would increase from 8.5% to 10%, and annual increases are permitted. Qualified seniors, people living in affordable housing projects, and people with very low incomes would not have to pay the tax. The auditor estimates the first year revenue of $47.4 million. Next slide, please. So for some background, 10 years ago, the League recommended voting for Measure Z, the renewal of a parcel tax and parking fees to support these same things, police, fire, and violence prevention services. We hoped for a coordinated public safety effort that documented the effectiveness of its strategies. Unfortunately, those hopes have not been realized, but we acknowledge that challenges arose from the COVID pandemic, new forms of criminality, and struggles to effectively staff and deploy Oakland's police forces. Once again, the League does recommend voting for a renewal of this tax in hopes that lessons learned, stricter requirements for data-driven investments, and a mandate of 4-year plans coordinating citywide efforts will yield the desired results. Our recommendation also takes into account that loss of these tax revenues would have serious impacts given Oakland's current budgetary challenges. Measure NN is needed to enhance public safety by funding critical violence prevention programs for police and firefighters and to provide resources to improve the 911 system. We do have concerns. Bringing this measure to the ballot as an initiative may have been strategic because it lowers the bar for passage to 50% plus one. We deeply regret that this strategy foreclosed public input and legislative debate. Further, the measure imposes a significant tax increase while leaving unspecified what the particulars of the four-year public safety plans will be. Next slide, please. And the final Oakland measure on the ballot is Measure 00, and this is about the Public Ethics Commission. In 1996, Oakland voters approved the creation of an independent Public Ethics Commission. This is composed of 7 volunteer commissioners and a small department of city staff members who support the commissioners. The commission ensures compliance with Oakland's government ethics, campaign finance, transparency, and lobbyist registration laws. In 2014, voters gave the commission additional authority and increased its staffing. Now, 10 years later, the commission's investigative workload has increased significantly and now greatly exceeds its staffing capacity. As a result, half of the commission's investigative workload has been placed on hold. Measure 00 proposes changes to existing laws governing the Public Ethics Commission, including updating the governance and quorum rules and staffing classifications to streamline commission operation, adding 1 ethics investigator, and lowering to $50 the maximum gift limit to elected city office holders, candidates, or members of their immediate family. I think we need to be back on the 00 slide. Thank you. On the fiscal effects. Great, thank you. So fiscal effects are hiring an additional ethics investigator effective July 2026 is estimated to cost approximately $242,000 for salary and benefits. And separately, the proposed flexibility in this measure for classification of several employees could result in some savings of either $90,000 or increased costs of $87,000. Next slide, please. The League believes that in order to be effective, the Commission must have the resources needed to manage its actual workload and should regularly update its governance in light of current professional standards. In addition, stricter ethics rules, such as the limitation of gifts from lobbyists to public officials and candidates for public offices, are desirable. Therefore, the League supports Measure 00. And that's it for the Oakland measures. So I'm going to turn it back to Helen.
Thanks, Debbie. So thank you all for being here. We will be taking questions. I see a few people with hands raised. If you would please type your questions into the Q&A, we will be working from that to answer them. I'm just going to add a few closing notes too. We in the League are celebrating our centennial this year, so 100 years of championing democracy in Oakland. You can visit our website, lwvoakland.org, for more voting resources. And vote411.org is our national voting platform. If you enter your address, you can see everything that will be on your ballot. And there are also voting resources there. Finally, we invite everyone who is not yet a member of the League to become a member. And we do offer a sliding scale fee to support all budgets. And most importantly, it's a validation of the work we in the League do. So I think I'll just start asking questions. And I think the first ones are going to, because they were for the first couple of measures, are going to go to Gail. So Gail, can the funds that would be raised by Prop 2 be applied to remediate lead problems in the Oakland school water pipes?
Okay, thank you for that question. And I think we can let the slides go now and just have ourselves as talking heads, if that works for everyone. Okay, so the question about how these Prop 2 funds would be applied. The way I think about it is that Prop 2 fills the state's bucket. The state has a kind of undifferentiated bucket of money that it uses to offer matching grants to local school districts. those local school districts will be submitting and have submitted applications for particular projects within their districts, such as, for example, remediation of lead in the pipes or replacement of a roof or, renovation of a plumbing system. So all those requests are in the pipeline. What's not in the pipeline is the money for the state because it's all been used up. So this Prop 2 simply asks you to fill the state's bucket so it has resources to be responsive to those local requests. Voting for Prop 2 does not in and of itself entail approval of any specific local school district's project. That's just part of the process, right? And that money will be given out according to their established priorities to school districts across the state for many problems, such as the one currently plaguing the Oakland schools with the lead in the pipes. Please go ahead and add follow-up questions in the Q&A if they occur to you, or if we haven't completely answered your question.
So the next question is also about bond indebtedness, and what is the overall current bond debt for all bonds in California? And, it says 2 and 4 would get us to the 3 to 4%.
Right. So my colleagues were talking. I went to the legislative analyst's office, and great place to Google if you want to answer these kinds of questions. And what I found out quickly is that earlier this year, the total state debt was 79 billion for bonds that have been issued. There's another 30 billion of bonds that have been authorized but not yet issued. That means not yet sold. Right? So bonds, when we approve of bonds, they're not sold all at once, right? They're sold and we take the money in and it's staged over a period of time. That's why we refer to a pipeline. So we have the 79 billion already out there in bond debt, 30 billion more in bonds we can issue. And it did confirm that passage of 2 and 4 would take us to a percentage of between 3 and 4%. So bond indebtedness would be 3 to 4% of total California budget. But I highly recommend the Legislative Analyst's Office for more detailed information.
Great. So the next question, Gail, has to do with Prop 4, and it asks whether Prop 4 would have chaparral being destroyed. And
Okay.
do you know anything about that? Can you
Yes, I have taken a look at the Chaparral Institute's website, and I do see, as the art questioner mentions, that they are opposed to some of the policies of fire prevention with respect to the treatment of chaparral, which is a type of vegetation that we have a lot here in our Mediterranean climate. So Proposition 4 is, let me say, it's at a broader level than just particular decisions about fire prevention. Yes, it's true that the money, some of it, the major portion is going to water projects, but there is a significant portion for fire prevention, and that would be given through to the fire prevention efforts throughout the state and be used according to their current policies. I understand that the Chaparral Institute has sued the state fire authorities, asking them to change that current policy. So I don't have the particulars as to whether specifically this money would be put into that aspect of fire prevention, because I don't think that's been decided yet. But I'll take our questioner's word that to some extent there is policy about chaparral that the Chaparral Institute is addressing. But this is a kind of bigger picture thing. Are we going to put these money into these large efforts in these areas, but the particulars, how it gets dispersed through those areas and those efforts and what policies are implemented are probably better addressed at the agency level than in a decision on the proposition.
Thanks. Okay, I think Mary, you wanted to address this one about prices. Are prices fixed in prison? Would the current pay allow prisoners to purchase what they need?
So the current pay in prisons is very low. It's around 74 cents an hour, or it could be up to $1, I think, for fighting wildfires an hour. So it's very low. If this If Proposition 6 passes, the Department of Corrections would be required to develop a voluntary work program with rules, and it would include the new payments that would be made to prisoners for different types of work. But that is all to be determined. And it doesn't necessarily need to be at minimum wage. It could be less than that, but it certainly should be more than they're receiving now. Thank you.
Next one had to do with Prop 35, so I think that's for me. It says that Prop 35 would make some Medi-Cal funding long-term, but does not guarantee the funding for the health needs of children who are under 5 years old, nor the behavioral health of adults. That's correct. Prop 35 would make some funding for Medi-Cal, would increase the payments and make it more permanent, but not all. And so this is confirming that one. Debbie, somebody wanted to know about the statement about NN increasing the taxes without doing something.
Yeah, I was talking about the concerns that the league has, and I said the measure imposes a significant tax increase while leaving unspecified what the particulars of the 4-year public safety plans would be. I think that's what they're asking.
Okay, thank you.
And what we mean by that is that if I may jump in, is that the measure itself provides that there will be 5 commissioners, and the duration of the measure is 9 years. The intention is that those commissioners will take the first year to develop the first 4-year plan. We know it will involve coordination among all city departments, but other than that, that plan will emerge as opposed to being set forth at the beginning.
The next question is who interviews the Ethics Commission? And so maybe that's who appoints the Ethics Commissioners.
Yeah, there's a process that of application, and there's a selection committee. So anyone is free from the public to apply to become an ethics commissioner. There are 7 ethics commissioners, and they are supported by a small department of city employees. They apply to, and their applications are reviewed, and then a selection committee makes recommendations to the commissioners as to, the ones that they wish to pass forward for the commissioners' consideration. And there are certain requirements about conflicts of interest and other things. And then those applicants are interviewed by the commissioners and selected by the commissioners.
Is it not true that at least some of the commissioners are appointed by the mayor and the city auditor?
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Yes. So the mayor has one appointment and the city auditor as well. And others come through the selection committee.
So the commission grows itself.
Yes.
Okay. Next question is on Measure O. Does the Ethics Commission or the city auditor investigate whistleblower reports of unlawful behavior by City of Oakland elected officials?
Okay, I'm going to say, and please jump in, that it's the Ethics Commission, the investigative arm of the Ethics Commission, which does the investigations on any whistleblower reports of violations of Oakland's rules. And those would be rules on disclosure, campaign finance, anything else that we've written into the code.
And then there are some thank yous, but there's also for one last question here. So for measures like MM and NN, are there strong built-in rules that prevent the city council from using these funds for other needs?
I can take that. So the funding for Measure MM could only be used for the specific purposes laid out in the measure and could not be transferred to fund other city activities. And the money already allocated from the general fund to support the annual standard inspections of parcels conducted by the fire department would continue to be used for that purpose. And with NN as well, the monies the elected officials can't switch it over to using it for something else. It has to be used for public safety and violence prevention.
And there is, we'll just add that there is also there a position that's being established in the auditor's office to track the expenditures under Measure NN.
Okay. That's all the questions in the Q&A.